Welcome, everybody. I am Therese Fortin-Barnes. I am an environmental toxins health coach and the head guru at the Green Living Gurus, and I'm thankful for you tuning in today. I have a special guest with me today, Professor La'Meshia Whittington from the North Carolina Black Alliance. La'Meshia is a professor in the Division of Sociology at Meredith College. She is also the Deputy Director for Advanced Carolina and the Campaigns Director for the North Carolina Black Alliance. She is the co-convener of the North Carolina Black and Brown Policy Network, former National Democracy Campaigner for Friends of the Earth, Chairwoman of the Frank Fund Administration, founding member of Democracy Green, member of the Burke Women's Fund in Western North Carolina, and the former North Carolina spokesperson on Fair Courts for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Professor Whittington leads the work on intersectional democracy and environmental justice. She was co-author of the North Carolina Senate Bill 673, prioritizing environmentally contaminated communities of color in voting rights, and co-author in several pro-democracy North Star legislation bills. She is a member of the North Carolina Pfas team, anchoring AFF legislation, and a convener of the Black Firefighters Fighting PFAS Collective. Professor Whittington has created and co-convened national, regional, and statewide tours and workshops on environmental justice, namely chemical contaminants and dirty corporations. She continually works with the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University, DHHS, and the government agencies to ground community needs and strategies and alleviating health disparities in Black and Brown communities. She led the development of a statewide map to highlight the intersection of environmental justice, contamination zones, and the frequency in which they are located within gerrymandered Black majority voting districts. She is a petitioner in 2 active petitions to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on PFAS 1 and 4 dioxin. Professor Whittington is an Afro-Indigenous woman from North Carolina, hailing from a former environmental justice settlement, the Kingdom of Happy Land. She received her education at Western Piedmont Community College in Meredith. She is also, I found this somewhere, La'Meshia, classically trained instrumentalist performing 7 instruments. Did I get that right?
You did. You found that deep in the interwebs. Yes, that's correct.
I did. You know, anytime there's anything to do with music, I'm like, my mind goes right there. And my dad had visions of all of us playing some type of classical instrument. It didn't work. Piano. 2 of us did the piano and violin, but 7 instruments. I was like, whoa, that's like a whole entire, you know.
It's a family trait. And we're also Celtic musicians. A lot of folks don't know that. So we used to, as kids, we would go around and actually travel in a teen and kid Celtic performance group. So that's a fun fact.
That is awesome. Well, if I could have found that online, I would have posted that somewhere because I would have gotten a kick out of that. I'm sure you have family videos somewhere on all that.
We do.
Well, welcome today. I appreciate you finding the time to join me here. I know you are very busy.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad we landed on time and I can join you virtually, wish was in person, but, maybe
Yes.
post-pandemic goals.
Someday I'll be joining you in Washington fighting this fight of the dangers of PFAS, which is what we are talking about today. And I'll let you talk about that. I'll just talk just a little bit before I let you take over. But a lot of people don't understand what PFAS are, and we'll get into that. But they are called the forever chemical and are pervasive in the blood of the US population. It's becoming more and more apparent. And exposure to these forever chemicals can cause cancer, thyroid disease, birth defects, hormone disruption, decreased fertility, immune system suppression, and other very serious health effects. And recently, the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, denied a petition to address these threats to public health from these PFAS chemicals in the Cape Fear communities. And Cape Fear, for people that don't understand where that is, but it's a coastal plain and tidewater region of North Carolina centered about the city of Wilmington. And it's the region takes its name from the adjacent Cape Fear headland, as does the Cape Fear River, which flows through the region and empties into the Atlantic Ocean near the Cape. So this petition that they asked the EPA to use their authority under the Toxic Substance Control Act, which is called TSCA, to require Chemours, I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it, Chemours company, which is a spinoff of DuPont, to fund a comprehensive health and environmental effects testing on 54 PFAS manufactured at its production facility in Fayetteville. And as a result of decades of pollution, these substances have been found in human blood, drinking water, groundwater, soil, air, and locally produced food adjacent and downstream from the plant. And they pose serious health risks in nearly 300,000 people in these impacted communities. And just in October of 2020, they denied that petition. So let's start with where PFAS are, and then we'll talk about where things are with this ruling.
Absolutely. So again, thank you for having me on. To back up a bit, and you're completely spot on, right? This chemical that we're asking in the petition, we're asking for it to be tested in addition to being regulated, but to let that data be completely public to the community for transparency. And so that seems it seems like such a basic request, right? We deserve for these chemicals to be tested before they're placed into our household everyday consumer products and items. But that's the reality that we're facing, right? Many chemicals, not just PFOS or PFAS, here in North Carolina and across the nation aren't tested annually before they go to market. Well, PFAS was one of those groups of chemicals. So there are many PFAS, like it's a whole group. It's not just one type of chemical, it's an assortment. We are just tackling 54 of those PFAS chemicals in hopes that we can push the EPA, as you already said, to test. I know we'll get more on the petition. But in North Carolina, a few years ago, we had in 2018 Hurricane Florence. And so we have in the state regular occurrences of 500, 1,000-year storms that are a year and 2 years apart. That's regular for us, and it's becoming more and more, of course, increased because of climate change, other impact in our environment, and the like. So we in North Carolina deal with an assortment of environmental issues, right? We deal with hurricanes, we deal with coal ash. We just achieved the largest coal ash excavation in the history just a year and a half ago that communities were dealing with for decades. We deal with CAFOs, so concentrated animal feeding operations. We have more hogs than people, largest and first and second production in the nation. So this is on top of the PFAS, right? So a lot of our communities, especially Black and Brown communities, are dealing with cumulative impact. And so what we saw, right, is when hurricanes came through, is there was a lot of breach of hurricane waters that would help breach the animal waste from hog production facilities, the PFAS, and it was spreading it. Right. So not only was it in the Cape Fear River, as you already elevated, we are also seeing the contamination spreading across many different counties. So in addition to New Hanover, which is at the lower point of the state in Southeast, we also have counties that wrap all the way around Cape Fear. Right. So you'll hear Cumberland County, Bladen, Brunswick. There's hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians that have been poisoned and impacted. And so we were looking at all of these contaminants in addition to impacting schools. We recently, in the past year, achieved 2 or 3 schools being tested enough to be tested to find it was positive. These schools have used bottled water for the past 5 to 10 years, and some a little bit more recent, but just recently we were able to say, okay, it's actually positive. That's how long it took us. So you have children who are using bottled water at school for 5 years, but it was only found to be positive a year ago.
Wow.
So you're seeing years of impact of unknown. The chemical is unknown, right? The unknown impact. Okay, now that we, know we've been exposed to this chemical and we know that it is allegedly, and we know if you're in community, it's not so much alleged, it's just science. We have to say allegedly and legally.
Right.
It's allegedly at fault for all these cancers, all these illnesses. In children as young as 4 or 5 years old. Okay, now we're just coming into the awareness that this exists, right? That it is mostly not just in our water, but also air emissions. And I'll kind of get into some other areas as well. So we're dealing with the fact that communities of proximity are breathing in the contaminants from the air emissions from the facility at Chemours, like you said. We're looking at the fact that because it's carbon, it attaches itself to trees. And so there was a study done where it was actually attaching itself to pine needles. And when it rains, okay, well, that's when it reaches the groundwater, a contamination additionally, not just in the Cape Fear River. These are some areas of just natural environment that is contaminated. You can't even go outside and breathe the air. So we are just coming to a point where we're like, oh, as a community, as a state, what is this? What are these chemicals? Then, oh, it's in me. And then now we don't have the data, even though we've had PFAS for decades, we don't have the data to say, okay, what does it do? What does it do long term? I'll say this point, then I'll back up and create space. But for our communities, Black and Brown, I know there's a new term called BIPOC, which means Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So I may use that interchangeably for just sake of brevity. But for BIPOC communities, there's also, again, cumulative impact. There are food deserts for low wealth populations and BIPOC communities. In North Carolina, we have 100 counties. Out of 100, 80 of those are food deserts. Wow. So many of our, prime areas for food are going to be corner stores or fast food. So fast food restaurants are a main source of quick meals for families because it's closer. Okay, that is the largest source of exposure to PFAS for these food desert and low wealth and BIPOC communities. Why? It's because PFAS has been tested to be found in the actual materials, the packaging that holds this food, from storage to actually reaching the restaurant to being just in the back of the restaurant on the back shelf. But it leaches in the desserts, the burgers, the buns, all of it. So our communities who are working here, right? Essential workers, franchise workers, they're working and they're eating meals while on shift, but you also have many communities in food deserts. That's where they go daily. So we are seeing, of course, our communities are daily, digesting PFAS. For our children, our largest source of exposure for our kids is the carpet. The stain repellent on carpets. And we know that some companies are now, saying, hey, we're going to discontinue the use of PFAS infused carpet. Even with fast food, McDonald's has now committed to ceasing and disusing, right, in 2030. So we still have 9 years of exposure. And then how about landfills, right? After that, okay, where's all this stuff going? Because that comes right back to us and the earth. But we're also looking at carpet. So when we're talking about affordable housing for low wealth populations, and we're talking about, they oftentimes they come into an already pre-established building, right? They're not choosing the carpet. They're not choosing, the layout of what the infrastructure is in their building, right? So they're coming into a carpet in an area that may potentially have PFAS already on the pre-chosen carpet. And you're not aware of that. That's not in your pamphlet. That's not in a welcome home. So we're also having to see the intersections of, when we're talking about affordable housing, again, in low wealth populations, we're also having to talk about the actual health impacts of going into affordable housing, not being safe housing.
Right.
So that's some of the things that we're dealing with, many more, and we'll get into it. But that's some of our largest barriers in BIPOC is just all the many places that PFAS is hiding.
And then on top of it, you have it being, in the river and the drinking water.
Right.
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 So what are environmental justice communities, and how are they impacted by PFAS and similar chemical contaminants?
Right. So environmental justice communities, the definition of EJ is super flexible, but the reality is the justice is the people, and the justice is how both the land and the people together are contaminated or harmed in a way that's not sustainable. And so you see that it's not so much, sometimes we'll look at environmentalism. There's so many lanes of environmental work, but oftentimes we see it in a framework of, what are we doing to the land? Environmental justice is saying, okay, what are we doing to the people in the land? And also, how is the land being contaminated in such a way that it's poisoning the very people who live on it, the very stewards of that community? So it's looking at the coupling of the impact on some of our communities. And so that renders areas vulnerable or marginalized. And so in environmental justice in North Carolina, in Warren County, and it's interesting because this was a chemical contaminant in the 80s, EJ was actually birthed in North Carolina. Not so much the work, the movement. There were many movements across the nation that, were moving the work before the 80s. But the term itself and the movement was birthed from a community, a Black community in Warren County, North Carolina, who literally laid in the middle of the road to stop trucks from dumping PCB, another chemical, that was in soil, from being dumped into their community because their community was seen as undervalued, right? And it was like, well, why did you choose our community? And they were pushing back and saying, first of all, it's going to leach in our groundwater, and it's going to leach in our well water. And, our state pushed back, said, no, it'll be safe. We'll place it in one area, we'll coat it, all these, very fantastic lies. Let's just call it what it is. Yep. And of course, it happened, right? It leached, it poisoned a lot of the residents, and many, still dealing with the illnesses, the rare cancers to this day from the 80s. So that's just an example of EJ and the fact that North Carolina is the birthing place for the term itself, which holds great pride for me being from the state, but also great sadness because we're still dealing with EJ, right? And so our communities are engaging in a couple of things, right? And so it goes back to, again, cumulative impact. We have to address all the things. We can't afford, as EJ communities, to say, okay, today I'm going to address coal ash. Tomorrow I'll address PFAS. Like it's literally a rotating schedule. Right. And I, unfortunately, I consider kind of dark humor for our communities, but we were joking in this meeting the other day about, you just have to get on the schedule of the week to know what we're fighting. Monday is PFAS day. Tuesday is, CAFO day. This is deforestation day. This is wood pellet day. We literally have to switch out because it's all the things, right? And our communities are undercounted in the census, which means that many corporations use that fact to say, hey, no one lives here because the census data doesn't show that people live here. And we think we need to move in this less populated area for the safety of humanity. Well, of course, people live there, they're just undercounted. Many rural areas are, either don't have internet access, like last year, to access the census online, or for years, there's a lot of, different reasons that communities are undercounted, many reasons. But that sets us up for corporations being able to move in with some of these chemical contaminants. The other element is disenfranchisement. And I know you mentioned at the top of the call with some of the work that I've led around proving that environmental justice communities align almost perfectly with like Jim Crow level disenfranchisement with voting rights. And oftentimes it's like, okay, well, how is that connected? Why is that connected? Again, the census is a huge connecting point, but two, a lot of our elected leaders, and there are some that are great, obviously here that we support, that's part of my work at the Black Alliance as we work with Black elected officials, but we have some nefarious characters who actually supported these corporations, gerrymandered themselves into districts so they couldn't be voted out, received over $200,000+ from some of these corporations, and then wrote actual bills that were passed into law, or some that were vetoed, but it protected these corporations from being sued up to a certain point. So that's some of the things that we're dealing with in the EJ community, and how we're having to handle it is really thinking about a strategy that has to do all. We have to fight PFAS, and we're having to push petitions and local consent orders, but educate our people at the same time of still trying to find healthy access to food and food deserts and medical support and medical deserts. So it's all the things.
You're juggling a lot,
right.
I can tell. And there's a lot of people that are behind fighting with you, I'm assuming, from all the reading that I did. But it's a hard battle when you're fighting somebody like DuPont and Chemours. Is that how you pronounce it? Chemours?
Chemours.
So do you get a lot of pushback from Chemours?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's two different pushbacks, right? So you have hyper local community. We have folks, again, when you're in rural areas, I'm, from a rural area, I'm a country girl. And so oftentimes we work for those corporations. So that's also a different type of pushback that sometimes we don't consider, right? Legally, it's all litigation. It's, okay, this is our response, which is still pushback. And, if the industry is, as I was saying before about like some, politicians unfortunately take funding for certain corporations, that's real, that element happens. But then when we get hyper local, we have to consider also the impact of pushback for folks who that's their livelihood because that's the only industry in the area. And it's a very, it's rock and a hard place because there were workers that they were the first to be contaminated. They were the first to be, really ill. And it's this fight of like, okay, I need to, I need this income for my family. I can't afford my medical bills. So I'm going to do what? I not feed my family, then have medical bills I can't afford. I just need to deal with it. And so that comes from the economic disparities, right? The economic pressure that these companies hold on our people, which is also part of that lack of accountability, that you shouldn't be allowed to not test chemicals, experiment basically on your workers to see what the impacts are. And I'll unpack that here in a minute. But then also, how are you taking care of the very folks that work for you, that live in these rural and sometimes urban areas as well, of course? How are you taking care of them? And what does that mean with law? That's a different type of pushback, but it's real.
So it just amazes me in 2021 that we are even still dealing with this, but it seems to me it's gotten worse. It's gotten better in the sense that more people are out there fighting it like you are and raising concerns and talking about it. But it just seems like, are we still like in the 40s and 50s and they're putting these chemicals still in the water? And it just amazes me. And we are. And I know that through the movie Dark Waters, which I know you know all about, and Rob Billett's book, which I know you know all about too, because that's right upstream pretty much from North Carolina and Parkersburg, West Virginia. And I know that a lot of similar situations, isn't it? With that
absolutely.
Yeah. So so now where are we now with things in North Carolina and with that petition and the EPA?
Right. So as you stated before, we submitted the petition, the first round, I'd call it the first petition, last year, October 10th. And so that petition was denied under the previous administration and the Trump administration. And so we received that now at the top of this year. And we refiled at least about a month ago. And so we're in the same process of, upcoming conversations that we'll have with the EPA, discuss our requests, but also, we work with incredible scientists who are also helping us to ground what are we asking in terms of how would the research be conducted? What will that actually look like? And so those conversations are coming up, but we have refiled again. Which is hopeful, and it's great. We were able to be in a place to work with Secretary Regan, who is now Administrator Regan, right?
I was going to ask you about Michael Regan. Yes.
Right.
Yep.
So, Secretary Regan here in the state is from an area that was one of the hot zones for coal ash. Okay. Right, growing up. And so this is in the east, which again, still same area that is probably also dealt with PFAS. We're just getting kind of around to who all is contaminated because we need more testing. By the way, we need absolutely more testing. But he grew up in an area that was almost number one in the state for coal ash. And so he, working in the DEQ wasn't his first introduction to, his environmental work, but his work in the DEQ, he was able to achieve the largest coal ash excavation that I mentioned earlier. That was his charge. And so, it was triumphant to be able to see him come right back around and clean up coal ash, which is what he was exposed to as a child. It's almost vindication for his family. And it tells you a lot about kind of North Carolinians' tenacity and like it's a lifetime commitment, right? You're growing up with this stuff and you're like, well, I need to fight it. So I'm just going to become this regulator so I can, address it. So you see, again, our legacy, but the impact again of EJ following you for life. So we were able to actually conduct a tour last year prior to the petition being filed with the same co-petitioners. And we were able to actually do a premiere of Dark Waters. And we brought Mark Ruffalo to North Carolina. And so he toured with us in Wilmington and met with Secretary or Administrator Regan. And we went up to the Capitol and spoke to other electeds to make them aware, this is why we're doing this. This is why we're doing this. This is what we need you to do to hold these corporations accountable. But it was great to have that tour to, place more in a national, light what we're going through. So we'll have more support because you're only, as you said, there are a lot of people beside me, with me, in front of me, behind me. But the more people that can march with us to Washington, the better, right? It's a community effort here, and community is really national because all of us are impacted by PFAS. But it placed us in a position to already, make Secretary Regan, now that he wasn't already familiar, but definitely more familiar with what we were asking for in this upcoming petition. So we filed the petition, and then in December, the Black Alliance, we were able to do a pretty strong push to support Administrator Regan, just the appointment, just say, okay, we'll say, we don't know how the work will be with another administrator in another state, California, or we don't know, but we do know that we've been able to have these conversations with Secretary Regan in his previous role. And we hope that in his upcoming role as administrator, that him being familiar with PFAS, the work that we've made familiar, right? That it won't be a new conversation and that we can really get something done. So that's the hope with also refiling this petition, is to say, okay, we need to get this across your desk because we've discussed this with you, right? Leading into this role. So that's where we are. I can't speak too much on the legalese and the details because I know there's more emerging, and I don't want to give anything away that might be, rendered confidential, but that's where we are.
Yes, I'm hoping when I saw that he was hired, I was like, okay, hopefully this is a step in the right direction. It's funny, his name, I call him Michael Reagan because his name is exactly the name of a boyfriend I dated for 10 years in high school. So I text all, his family members. I'm like, how Michael became the head of the EPA. Anyways, so let's hope that, knock on wood, things are going to start changing for North Carolina and the people of North Carolina, and especially the ones in the BPOC communities. So I hope and pray that, and I'll be following along. I'll be staying on top of you. I want to see, I want to see what's happening. So, and so we hope that there's hope in the future. We pray there's hope in the future, right? I mean,
right.
That's how I look at it. I know some of it can be so dismal and depressing, but the hope is that there's people like you that are coming forward and really doing some great work. And what can other people do that aren't necessarily, don't have that kind of time, or they're raising a family and they're trying, what can communities do, whether it's in North Carolina or wherever you may be? Is there something that other people can do to help get something done in their community, or call
Right.
their local politician and see what's happening? Any advice you have?
Right. So all the above of, calling your electeds, but let me back up a little bit. I'm a huge advocate for, if I'm going to tell you about something, I need to make sure you're well informed of also like your options. And so the first thing is taking care of your family, because again, 98 to 99% of all of Americans already have PFAS in our bloodstream. So whether we know we're impacted, right? Because this is traveled. And even, when I brought up earlier the hog farms, the other reason I brought that up is because the facility that we are challenging the petition is in proximity to one of the facilities for the corporate hog farm. So you literally have the food from that corporation sitting in PFAS contaminated water that's in PFAS contaminated packaging that's being shipped across the nation. So that's the reality that's impacting all of us. So there are elements that, I would encourage listeners, if you haven't already, to check out like Center for Environmental Health. And they'll link to other websites from there that will at least, inform you of the many products that PFAS is in. Just everything from like non-stick pans, throw them out, use cast iron.
Yep.
right? The fact that there are even feminine hygiene products, such as the Thinx underwear that came out, has PFAS in the lining of it. We're having to be really cognizant and very hyper aware of the many places that this chemical is hiding. It's in stain repellent on your mattress, stain repellent on your carpet. And just looking into those companies would be the first thing, is so that you're informed and your family's informed. Because it's hard to advocate for yourself or for your neighbors if you're sick. It is super hard to do that, right? So that's the first thing, right? The second thing that definitely, please follow the petition and the petitioners that have filed a petition. And why is because there will be, Center for Environmental Health is a national organization that, in addition to us, North Carolina Black Alliance, Democracy Green, Toxic Free NC, Clean Cape Fear River Watch, we're North Carolina based. CEH is more national, but here's the thing. Our PFAS petition is filed, but also our 1,4-dioxane, and that's going through California courts. So we are giving up-to-date information that has to do with the science and has to do with what's coming up for everybody, not just North Carolina. So making sure you're supporting and following these organizations will also say, hey, we need you to sign on to this letter. You'll already be in the know if you're following and say, okay, let me sign this letter. Let me, place my name from, if I'm in Nevada, I'm just going to sign it. I don't care if it's going from North Carolina, because it's going to the EPA. That's what's happening. It's national now, and state level. So following those organizations. And then third, the other, I would branch off of two things. Have these conversations with your legislators, right? And have these, make them aware. Most of our electeds we're finding are not that they're not willing to have the conversation. They oftentimes don't know what it is because it's an emerging contaminant. It hasn't been tested. So it's not mainstream. So have the conversation, and then also have the conversation with your doctors. That's the other part, right? And so to your point, you're exactly right. It is hope for another day. Currently, the National Academies of Science has launched a PFAS study in which they will give recommendations to the CDC to create clinician guidelines. So how can doctors actually, address PFAS? How can they test it? Can insurance providers cover it? Which is my hope, is that we can actually support folks who don't have insurance, be able to afford in urgent care, medical desert type areas, but also how can we make sure that insurance actually does cover testing and support? That's long-term goals, but that study is happening this year. And so there are ongoing. So even please visit the National Academies of Science, PFAS, it will be on their website. There are upcoming town halls. You can actually go right now and submit questions for the town hall of your region. These scientists, experts, and community liaisons. I'm actually a community liaison for this study. I was honored to be nominated and selected, and several of the petitioners have also been selected as community liaisons for this National Academies. We will be there. For the Eastern region, April 7th is our town hall, but there are town halls happening after that. Join those calls, ask the questions, right? And that's the other thing. And that will also help us be able to hear what are impacts that maybe you're facing that you didn't know was directly attributed to PFAS. We have folks now that are even sending in, think about this, folks are even sending in everything from baby diapers and even a bottle, like the bottle tops, all the way to breast implants, just to be tested. So if you can imagine it, we need to test it if it has plastic. So attend those town halls, ask questions, but that'll also help folks to be in the flow so that we can get the right medical information to our practitioners so that they're supported with actually treating our communities when we go through the door at hospitals or urgent cares or the like.
Yeah, because there's a lot of information there, but it's great. And if you're confused by what this is, just Google PFAS, PFAS, and you'll see a whole laundry list of articles and products that it's in. Some people don't think, oh no, what it's in dental floss. Dental floss. It's in the bottom of a pizza box. If you order pizza, it's in that plastic sheet that goes underneath your pizza. That actually New York State just passed a law that by 2023, I believe it is, that they have to get rid of the PFAS in that plastic. So it's everywhere, as La'Meshia is saying, and it's going to take all of us to help get these chemicals out of our lives and our environment. Now, unfortunately, there's some other chemicals coming along the way, like Gen X. I did a little bit of reading on that, and I know that that is another chemical that's been found in the drinking water down there. Not that we have to go into that, but is that of concern too, the Gen X?
Oh, yes, 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 yes. So how we look at it, and I really like your breakdown of PFAS, and in communities when we're talking about it, some folks will say, well, what's the point of it? Like, what's the point of PFAS and what's the point of Gen X? And it's place of products to make it waterproof, stain repellent. It's the everyday, if you're wearing shoes that, need to be waterproof because you're working outside, what made it waterproof? Think about those chemicals. It's also, right? So our firefighters, some of their foam and some of their clothing has PFAS. And that's the other reality that it's hiding and in these different areas, and even occupational hazards. Firefighters on a military basis, it literally goes from the foam into, of course, the local communities, but also we're working with Black firefighters right now in a group called Omnibus in North Carolina, and it'll be a national conversation that's coming up, that they're becoming acquainted with PFAS and then saying, wait, it's in our foam? So Gen X is just, that's the PFAS. Well, that's also Gen X. Gen X is how I define it, as the cousin, right? So PFAS is such a huge family. Again, it's this huge family of chemicals. The Gen X is just now the popular cousin, right? It's the Beyonce of the family is what I'm calling it right now, because they tested in Wilmington. It was like, oh my goodness, but it's literally a cousin. It's not, one set of PFAS, but it is related. It is absolutely the same type of just chemical contaminant, the impact of being forever. Your body, once you absorb it, digest it, your body can't break it down. It can't dissolve it. That's with PFAS and Gen X, right? And so because it's not organic, your body doesn't know, what do I do with this? So it just sits there in your bloodstream. And your body can't dissolve it. So it's forever, is why it's called that, or reference. And some people, don't resonate with the forever chemical, but sometimes it's just an easy way to call it. But Gen X definitely is a concern. We had a study here in Wilmington. We were able to, I believe it was, and I don't want to get the stats wrong, but I believe it was like 24% to 30% of the folks that were tested were found to have the contaminant, in their bloodstream. And so that's, another cousin, but that's what we're dealing with. And yes, it's happening at the same time and just as important.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So, so anything else you want to add to this before? Did we miss anything on PFAS? And I think it's such great information, and I will include those groups that people could follow. I'll pull out their websites and just add it to the show notes. And I'm sure I'm going to be talking to you again down the road. I'm not going to let you out of my sight.
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation. Not much to add. I would just encourage folks who are listening to know that, look, when you're talking about rural communities, look at well water as well as the city water. When you're talking about urban communities, look at the city water and the air emissions if they're living in proximity to the plant. When you're looking at fast food, again, look at packaging, parchment paper, as you already stated, carpets. So those are some of the areas on rural and urban. So it's both groundwater and air emissions. That's the largest source, but that doesn't always include BIPOC communities' largest source of exposure, because it's all the above. It's groundwater, it's air emissions, and it's the products, because we live in food deserts, especially in a state like North Carolina. And so that's one of the things that really, when folks are researching and looking at all the categories, because you don't know how your community or your neighbor's community could be impacted.
Right.
Where this is how it shows up in a rural setting. This is how it shows up in a medical desert setting. And so when we're looking at the proximity of folks who are breathing this in, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so folks have already, dealt with asthma that was created from these chemical contaminants. They're already dealing with kidney issues. Imagine what communities were more at risk, right, in the middle of COVID, because of previous underlying conditions that was created from these chemicals. So when we look at also communities and saying, okay, why is this community more impacted or ravaged by COVID-19? Look at the corporations that were already existing there for decades, sometimes less, that will show you the culprit. as to why communities and our immunities are sometimes, immune systems are compromised and not prepared for a pandemic. And what does that mean in health disparities? And that's the kind of health data that we're asking for, because we have to track over a long time, what are these communities going through, but what's the long-term impact? And the fact that a baby, like an expectant mother, can pass PFAS over the placenta, and then pass it through breast milk. We have to have that data to know what will that mother and child face through the entire lifespan of both of them, right? The mother, but we have to include the child from birth to developmental years to adulthood. And is that included when we say these corporations are regulated and they're, the EPA or a state like ours, DEQ, says, hey, we're going to require PFAS up to a certain limit. Well, did that limit include the expectant mother? Did that limit include both of those people? Or are you only talking about one human, one adult can eat or digest this much PFAS before it makes you sick? What did you take into account the infant? So those are certain, areas and elements I just wanted to elevate that we're still dealing with, but that's what we're really asking for.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. I so appreciate you taking the time, explaining everything. I'm here to support North Carolina. And I really, it was great to meet you on Zoom. One of these days I will meet you in person and we'll be able to give each other a big hug.
Yes, that's the vision.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So I always close by saying, read your ingredients and know your labels. And then namaste.